Everywhere. It's not the answer to every question, but it's usually part of the answer to most questions. My name's David Smith. I do cloud, among other things, here at Gartner. And we're going to talk about the future of cloud, which means we're going to make some predictions. We're going to talk about some implications. But I'm going to start by just giving us a little bit of perspective on where we are in the journey to the cloud. And this pyramid here shows a progression from the early days of cloud, where everybody thought of it and to a large extent still thinks of it as a technology disruptor. Certainly has wreaked havoc on a lot of IT markets. But it's moving up, and eventually it's going to get to business disruption. Now, most organizations are in the lower part of this pyramid today, but we see them getting up to the top within the next few years. So our time frame is 2027. Almost everything we talk about here will be phrased that way. And another good way to think about where we are is we're kind of at the end of the beginning of the initial cloud chapter. And really what that means is in the story of cloud so far, it's been dominated by public cloud vendors, the hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and a few others. But that's really what it's been about. In the future, and now, that doesn't go away, but it gets augmented by other things. Regional industry, sovereign clouds, edge computing, and on-premises deployments, something that people have been wanting to do for a long time. We'll talk more about that. But I also do want to take a few minutes to talk about how important cloud is. And we do surveys on a regular basis, and one of the things that has been shown recently is that the people we survey, which are mostly folks like you, believe today when we survey them that over 50% of them think that their enterprises, they say that cloud is either indispensable or heavily impactful for them. And in that same survey, we asked them, what do they think it would be in 2027? And it soared to over 90%. So that is a big thing. And that is reflected in the markets. You know, we have a very large market for public cloud services, and that is going to top $1 trillion in 2026. So this is something that is getting more and more important, but there's a lot more to it than that. I want to talk about the next chapter. What does it look like? Well, your first reaction to this slide is probably going to be, it doesn't look that dramatically different, but it is in some ways. We have these three kind of layers that kind of would remind most people of IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, but it's not exactly the same thing. We have at the bottom, we have a layer that we call the technology core. A lot of the hyperscalers did pioneer many things there. But we also have another layer above it, which we call enhancing those capabilities. So it builds on the lower level, but enhances it and gives more capabilities. And then really the goal of anything that you do is to create value and to enhance that value. So we're looking at solutions that leverage those capabilities and the technology core. Think not just SaaS, but think about things like Netflix and Peloton and all these other applications, if you will, or uses or solutions that leverage cloud computing in order to work. So I talked about there being the main vendors, but there are lots of other kinds of vendors as well, and we can categorize them roughly this way. You have those that are labeled A there. Those are the base infrastructure services. You have B, which are, for the most part, the hyperscalers. They are doing both in most cases, the technology core and the capabilities enhancement. And you have C, those who are focused mostly on just the platform or higher level services, not the core. D, which span the capabilities and the value. And E, which are purely like the ones I mentioned, Netflix, Salesforce, others like that. And then F, those that are trying to do everything. So companies like Microsoft fit F, Oracle fits F. So the question is, what's going to happen with all these vendors, and what does it mean to you? You're still going to be dealing with them, but they have a lot of choices as to where they're going to go. And in fact, we see a couple of paths for the main hyperscalers to go. They could take the path to expand up into value enhancement. So a company like AWS could choose to do that. Or they can choose to focus a little bit more on the capability enhancement and get out of the business of the technology core. So these are some of the things that you're going to be wanting to see and watch for in the vendor area. You're probably going to be dealing with a few more vendors in different kind of situations than you do today. I also want to talk about some things that go across different clouds, and I'm representing them here by this red or orange set of bars here. This is where you get into a lot of the discussion around multi-cloud. Multi-cloud and cloud native are two of the most abused and misunderstood terms that are out there. What we're talking about here are these layers that go across that can give you some function that goes across different clouds. So the one that's best known is Kubernetes, which is a container orchestration system that works across most types of environments in a limited capacity. It does not give you access to everything in terms of the capabilities down on the technology core. I'll talk a little more about that later. It's also in the data management side where you have something like Snowflake, which is a package that runs on all the different clouds and gives you some portability and consistency across all of them. But it's only for data management. It's not for everything. And then there are operations types of approaches. The one that comes to mind that's gotten some press is Walmart is doing these kind of things, abstracting up more from an operational perspective to try to mask underneath it. This also blends into some of the concepts like platform engineering, which has its pluses and its minuses. The pluses it does give you some of that portability and masking, but it also makes you dependent on yourselves. And that often means a particular person or a couple of people who are the brains behind something, and you always have to watch that they're going to get hit by a bus or something. So the focus on value enhancement is really the key. And I want to leave with this thing here about there's no going back. Cloud's not perfect everywhere, but it's not perfect. And there are issues with cloud that may hold people back a little bit from some adoption. However, there's no going back. People are not going to give up virtual work, streaming, democratization, some of the things that are coming, metaverse, Web3, super apps. They really work with things on the back end. And really, anything at scale. Anything at scale is a great application for cloud, and people are just not going to stand for not being able to do these kind of things. So there have to be ways to get around that. So I'm going to jump right into the predictions, which is really what the future is all about. And I'm going to talk about 4 of them and go into a little bit more detail on a couple of them. I mentioned cloud native and multi-cloud are the 2 really big topics that I hear about all the time. And our predictions around that are that 70% of the requirements that customers have for what they call cloud native, they're going to be delivered by the ecosystems around the cloud service providers, primarily the hyperscalers. And we use this term CSP native to refer to things that work really just on that cloud service provider versus the container-focused approach. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. 40% of enterprises' multi-cloud expectations will be unachievable, unrealistic. A little more on that too. Led by deglobalization, we see sovereign cloud emerging as a really big thing, in certain areas primarily. We say it's going to be a critical requirement in about 15% of enterprise RFPs, but that's a worldwide number and it varies tremendously. In North America, a lot lower, single digits for sure. In Europe and the rest of EMEA, more, as you might imagine. The world has moved on from being a globalization type of a trend to this deglobalization, and that changes a lot of things. And 50% of organizations are going to use industry cloud solutions to accelerate their digital business initiatives. So let's talk about cloud native first. What is cloud native? We've come up with a definition that is an umbrella term that can accommodate the different viewpoints that people have on this. So we talk about it as optimally leveraging or implementing the characteristics of cloud. So things like scalability and elasticity and measurability and ubiquity, all those kind of things are the characteristics. Underneath it, you can have some architectural principles that can help enable it. But really, under that, we have these other ones, 3 and 4, the CSP native, which I mentioned, use of the cloud service provider specific capabilities. So for example, if you're on AWS, you would probably use Lambda for serverless. You may use their availability zones. You may use their databases that only exist on AWS. That would be native to the CSP. The other use that is popular is a container-focused, a portability approach, Kubernetes, and other specific technologies. This is promoted by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which I like to note, CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, none of those C's stand for container, which you would think it might be, because that's really what they're all about. These two things are potentially contradictory. If you say cloud native, what do people hear? Well, they hear the words, but they don't necessarily know what it means. They could be thinking one way or the other. Now, if you have a multi-cloud, which I'm going to talk about next, if multi-cloud from an architectural standpoint is what you care about, this CSP native thing kind of goes against it, and the container-focused approach kind of goes with it. Even though containers don't give you the 100% portability, anyone remember Java? Very similar ideas. You get some value, but you don't get what's been promised. So these things are the root of a lot of the confusion in the cloud world today. And it gets even more complicated because you can use containers in the context of CSP native as well. Long discussion. Multi-cloud is another very hot topic. Now, the simple answer is multi-cloud is more or less inevitable and unavoidable for most organizations. First, what do we mean by it? Use of multiple cloud providers, public cloud providers, for the same general class of IT solution. So if you're using Azure and AWS, that would be multi-cloud. If you're using, say, AWS and Office 365, that would not be multi-cloud by most definitions, because it's different. Most start with one provider, and this maturity is key to understanding what's happening. Most start with one, but not all get to the last phase. There are 3 phases here. I call the first one tactical. This is where people start, they do one thing, they keep doing it, and eventually someone starts saying, hey, we're spending a lot of money here. Can we get a better deal by doing all of it with one provider, getting a volume discount, or should we play them against each other? That kind of thing. That's a time-honored tradition in IT to try to do that. Neither one really works all that well. But you also are going to discover, you may have decided on Google as your cloud provider, but you look around and you find within your organization a Microsoft shop that is not going to want to do that. And then if you have best of breed kinds of principles, that's going to lead you to multiple clouds. So you have, and mergers and acquisitions and other things also. So you get to this second phase here, which is where most are, which I call the acceptance. And acceptance means that you've come to grips and accepted that you're going to have multiple clouds. So how do you manage it and how do you govern it? And how do you control the costs with it too? There are a lot of issues there, but that's where most people are. The last phase here is leverage. This is where you're doing an architectural approach and really trying to do portability or dynamic provisioning, things like cloud bursting, and availability, which tends to be the real problem. And I'll show you some survey data now that'll give you a little bit of an idea of why we think that the expectations people have on multi-cloud are not going to be achievable for the most part. When you look at, we asked the question, and the data from 2022 is actual data. The 2027 number is our projection. When we asked people, 30% of them thought that their goal was tactical, like that cost containment, cost issue that I mentioned there. Majority, 40%, growing to 60%, are accepting it, and they're figuring out how to deal with it. The tactical ones are going down a little bit. On the leverage, I've separated it into two. The portability, which kind of stays constant. The fundamental equation on portability hasn't changed. And then on availability, today it's 20%. That's going to go down because people are going to realize that that doesn't really work. The reason is, if you are looking for high availability, disaster recovery, business continuity, it is far easier to get that kind of capability within an ecosystem. All the vendors have things like availability zones and regions and APIs that allow you to do that pretty easily within that ecosystem. If you were to try to do that across ecosystems, that's very difficult. Why this is coming to a head now is because you have regulators and others who are saying they're concerned, and rightly so, about cloud concentration risk. Too much dependence on any one vendor, essentially. And so without knowing the details of how all this works, the simple answer, if you don't know any better, is just tell them to use another cloud. And when you have a problem, move it from one cloud to another cloud. Automatically even, 5 seconds response. Again, I think people are going to learn that that doesn't really work. So these are some of the expectations, along with the one about people looking to have a layer across all the clouds. Now, I use the container management Kubernetes example. If you are trying to abstract up to a layer above the clouds, whether it's on-premises or cloud brand A or cloud brand B, they all have certain capabilities, certain functions, and you have to expose them and be able to use them and provide access to them at a higher level. But you can't really easily do that in a general purpose way across everything. So people who are thinking about or promising, the one layer above all that is going to make all the clouds underneath it irrelevant. Anyone remember the old days when people said operating systems don't matter? Yeah, same kind of thing. This is another example of why the expectations are out of whack. So in talking about the future of cloud, we wouldn't be complete without talking about this thing we call distributed cloud. Distributed cloud means that you can distribute the cloud services wherever you need them, essentially. And you do it in a way that the operation, the governance, the evolution of those remain the responsibility of the cloud service provider. So if you're thinking about what products and services fit this would be like AWS's Outposts, Microsoft, Azure Stack Hub, Google Anthos, IBM Satellite, Oracle Cloud at Customer. These are examples of those kind of things. And it can be used in different use cases. And sometimes there are other products from the companies that fit it. There are two use cases that are quite real today, but just not as widespread as some may have thought it would be at this point. The data center use case, the on-premises public cloud. That's something people have been wanting for a long time. People have been trying to do private cloud for a long time. It's really hard. Most of the time, people's private clouds are not really very cloud-like. They're really virtualization and automation and good things and maybe exactly what they need, but it's not the same. The other one is this IoT edge cloud, where you have edge computing, where lots of things happen at the edge, and it's all about the location, but you can use cloud and products and services from those cloud providers who can ease the management of those kinds of environments. Some of the others are a little more forward-looking. You see signs of them. The city center one, think of that as an evolution of smart buildings and smart cities and reusing existing infrastructure. I like to talk about the payphone infrastructure that still exists in most cities. You go into New York, they used to have payphones on every corner. That infrastructure is still there. Some of it's been repurposed for municipal Wi-Fi. That kind of thing can happen. Post offices, another one. A lot of post offices around. Do we really need them all? Could we repurpose some of that capacity? Good questions to ask. Let's talk about the enterprise implications. On the IT organization, what we're seeing is kind of a bifurcation into product groups using product management types of approaches over on line of businesses, and value add groups, more what you might think of as traditional kind of IT functions like enterprise architecture and corporate data science, et cetera, security. And then you have fusion teams, which you heard about a lot on the keynote, kind of spanning that. So this is where we see the future of the organization. And no discussion about cloud is complete without a discussion about security. Now, security is obviously incredibly important. It's also something where the conventional wisdom on cloud and security has changed quite dramatically over the years. If you go back 10 years or so, the prevalent thinking was, cloud's not secure. We can do it better on premises. However, in that time, some things have not happened. We have not seen big hacks and failures in the cloud providers. We've seen some things that sometimes people call cloud failures that really aren't. For, the one that gets a lot of press was the Capital One breach, which was very much determined to be the customer's fault, not the provider's fault. And a really good thing to highlight that you understand what the concept of shared responsibility means. It doesn't mean you point the finger at somebody else if there's a problem. It means that you have a well-defined, well-documented division of responsibility. So if you put stuff up there on an IaaS, you are responsible for what's up there, not them. You have to make sure that your applications are licensed and updated and patched and secured. Your data has to be secured. So even though the cloud providers, the big ones at least, they do an outstanding job at security, but they secure what they provide. So if they're infrastructure as a service providers, they primarily secure the infrastructure, not the applications, unless you start to go into managed service providers. Today, we've seen a 180-degree turn. Most people you talk to now actually think cloud is always more secure than on-premises. And cloud is, most of the time, more secure, but you never say always. And it's dangerous to be thinking that way if you're thinking it's just put it up in the cloud and it's secure. What we are seeing, though, is in the future, cloud is just going to be accepted, and a lot of the issues that we talk about may still be called security, but they're not the same. Today, a lot of the issues are around privacy, national security, sovereignty, those kind of things, and those are still issues, and those have not been solved. There are a lot to be done in that area. From enterprise request perspective, we talk about this concept of the cloud journey. Everybody is on their own cloud journey. The person sitting next to you probably has a very different idea of where they're going in the cloud, and they're probably coming from a very different place. So we use this kind of transit map analogy here to show that you have these different paths that you can take. If you're down in the lower one, that blue line is showing basically replacement journey. This is where you may upgrade, replace your hardware, replace your software, and get to something else. There are lots of different journeys, and you'll notice there are some that run, instead of horizontal, that way they run vertically. So that would be like a transformation kind of journey. Now you can do transformation at the I&O level, you can do transformation at the corporate level, so-called digital transformation. So there's a lot of different models that you can go with, and a lot of different journeys. But there are, even though they're different, there are two things, there are a lot of similarities, and there are two things you need in order to be successful in a cloud journey. You need a strategy, and you need an adoption plan. And they are not the same. I have a lot of sessions here this week on the cloud journey and avoiding the mistakes in your cloud strategy, et cetera. And a lot of it derives from that. And a real simple, looking at this in context is here. If you look at how planning should work, you would have 3 levels. You'd have a very highest level business strategy that's usually done by the most senior people in your organization. And below that, you have strategic plans. Strategic plans, there are going to be many of them. Cloud strategy is one of them. You probably already have a security strategy. You probably already have a data center strategy or a procurement. And by the way, data center strategy and cloud strategy are not the same. The whole idea here is these things need to be aligned. So if you did come up with a data center strategy that said, we're consolidating and our goal is to be completely out in 2 years, that is going to have an impact on your cloud strategy, but it isn't your cloud strategy, because your cloud strategy needs to be looking through each workload one at a time and figuring out what to do with it. So that's what business outcome-driven cloud strategy is really the issue. Cloud adoption, sometimes called execution, sometimes called migration, this is different. This is more addressing issues of how and when, whereas the strategy part is more what and why. Why are we doing this? What are we trying to accomplish? This produces a document called a cloud strategy document using something we call the Cloud Strategy Cookbook that's available to you to do that. And it's something that requires that you bring in people from not just IT in order to do that. The operating plans, on the other hand, the adoption plan, this is where you will focus in on the IT capabilities, and it will probably be a series of documents, very long, detailed, that help tell you how to do things and when to do them. Now, the biggest mistake that people make, I'll give you the real quick answer, because we only have a couple of minutes left. The big difference between, the big mistake that people make is confusing those two things or combining them. If you combine them, which is what people tend to do, they'll just put it all together and they'll call it a cloud adoption strategy. And it will be 90% adoption with a sprinkling of strategy in it. And it's even worse than that because you now have something that has the title strategy on it. So people will think that's a strategy when it really isn't. So that's why you want to separate it, and you want to separate it even more because if you do the business outcome part, you need business people, and business people don't care and are not interested in the details of how and when. So you have to separate it for that reason alone. Now I mentioned there are accelerators and inhibitors especially. There's certainly accelerators too. The pandemic, as it lingers, has proven cloud. The naysayers can't say cloud didn't handle it well. They can look at other things that didn't handle it well, like just-in-time inventory. How's that one working out? Not so good. Increased pace on digital and value add, but things that are holding it back, the deglobalization, ongoing concern about concentration risk and outages and breaches. But the big one is talent. Talent is, and we heard a lot about that at the keynote, and we're doing a lot of research on that. And that's the big thing. In fact, there are a lot of things you can do. And cloud itself, the fact that you are doing cloud can be very much a retaining and attracting tool. We also tell you to maintain 4 key competencies in-house, especially if you're going to cloud. The strategy, which we just talked about, sourcing, architecture, and security. And we also have some more specific advice for different roles, different IT leader roles. I'm going to focus in on the infrastructure and operations side, for the applications and development side. They have composable technologies, et cetera. On the data and analytics side, they have to be looking to the future for most of the new innovations to be happening there. For enterprise architecture and innovation, center of excellence and cloud strategy, sourcing and procurement needs to be able to deal with the agility requirements, fast track and pre-approvals, and security and risk we've talked about quite a bit. But for I&O, it's really all about designing and managing and governing for everything to be anywhere. The people, the applications, the data. They are increasingly going to be all over the place, and that's very different from the old way where everything was all in one data center or a couple of data centers or whatever. So it's a whole new world. So with that, I will leave you also with a list of our research in this area. And thank you very much for coming today, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.